Hello and welcome to this series that we have on the subject of salvation. It's a privilege that I have to speak to you, and I trust that the Lord will just make things about the importance of salvation, what it is, how to get saved, what happens at the moment of salvation, what is the fruit of salvation in our lives. I pray that the Lord will make that clear to us as we are busy studying this subject. Personal salvation is easily the most important issue of any person's life. Why is that? There's basically two reasons. There are more reasons, but let me just give you two reasons. First of all, my eternal destiny and my eternal future depends on whether I'm saved or not. If I'm saved, my eternal future is totally different than when I'm not saved. This is the first reason, and probably enough reason to make sure that I'm saved before the end of my earthly life arrives. But there's a second reason as well, and it basically says the same thing. The consequences for if I'm not saved is enormous and is astonishingly permanent. When I pass on from this life to the other, if I'm not saved, there's nothing I can do to undo that or to redo it or to get another chance to get saved. Then it's over and done forever. And therefore, the question whether I'm saved or not is an urgent question, and it's an urgent issue, and it demands absolute certainty of whether I'm saved or not this side of the grave, this side of eternity. Now, the importance of salvation is summed up for us in the Bible in 1 Timothy 1 verse 15, where the whole mission why Jesus came to earth is summarized in these words. 1 Timothy 1 verse 15, the last part, it says, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. To save sinners. That's the main reason why Jesus came. Now this that I'm sharing with you right now is just an introduction. We're going to look at salvation and the subject of salvation a little bit more in depth. And the subject on salvation is so vast, so extensive, it is impossible to cover every aspect that there is about salvation that the Bible put forward for us. So in this series on salvation, I just want to share with you the most essential truths that everybody has to know about salvation, and hopefully by this explanation, people will get a better grasp and a more firm grasp of what salvation means and why we need to get saved, how to get saved, etc. Now, this material of this series on salvation is for Christians and non-Christians. For Christians, so that we can get a better understanding of what salvation means, and hopefully also that will help Christians also to live a more Christ-like life. But it's also meant for non-Christians, for those of you who are contemplating Christianity and the faith in Jesus, and you want to know more. This is also meant for you, so that you can have a better understanding what God and what the Bible talks about when it talks about salvation, so that you can also understand the urgent need for salvation, but not only that, also that you can know, more importantly, that you can know how to get saved. That's most important. We can talk about salvation, but unless a person is actually saved, the goal of God for salvation for people, with salvation for people, has not yet been fulfilled. Now, there's basically two questions a person has to answer. and has to be able to answer. And that is number one, am I saved or not? The second question is, if I'm not saved, what must I do to be saved? And in this material that we're going to present to you, I trust that you will get the answer to these two important, urgent questions. Now, we have a two-part approach. I want to explain salvation to you from two approaches. Part one, I will explain to you salvation as being reconciled with God. In part one, I want to explain to you salvation as being reconciled with God. It's about relationship. In that, I will explain to you a person's need for salvation, how God provided for one's salvation, and also what a person must do to be saved. Then in part two, I want to explain salvation from a bit of an other's approach, and that is salvation as entering life from a state of death. Salvation as moving from death to life. And that will focus on God's work in a person at the moment of salvation, and even after that. So both parts describe the same salvation, just from two different angles or two different approaches. Now, before we go to part one, I just want to give you a brief explanation of salvation. Salvation in a nutshell. We find a summary of salvation in John 3, verse 16. And I just want to read it for us. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Now, there are basically two main truths that we can draw from this verse about salvation. The first truth is the bad news. The second truth is the good news. What is the bad news? The bad news is that there is a sin problem that separates each person from God, which causes each and every person to perish. Because people have sinned, they perish. That's the bad news. And we need to get an understanding of that. The good news is that the bad news is not the end of the news. There's good news. God has a solution to the sin problem. The good news is God's solution to the sin problem. The good news is that God loves each and every person, even though the person is separated from Him in relationship. Also, that God gave His Son to take the place in punishment, so that if that person believes in His Son that He gave, then God immediately saves him or her from that state of perishing. In that moment that person puts his or her faith and belief in Jesus Christ, in that moment he or she freely receives everlasting life. In the next two parts, we will look more in depth to all these aspects of salvation, the bad news and the good news. I'll see you in part one.